Today we are delighted to discuss China censorship, how it evolves, and of course after the 19th Party Congress, it's all the more concern. I won't say much because Jeff knows a lot about it and will be way more informed. So without further ado, I suggest we welcome Professor Jeffrey Wasserstrom from the University of Irvine on the West Coast. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be back here speaking. I've done it once before, but it's a particular pleasure to talk about this topic, which is not a pleasant topic, but in this place, because the FCC has been very good at pushing back against censorship and self-censorship. I was very pleased, for example, when it played host to the Penn anthology with challenging voices about Hong Kong after they were turned out unable to present that at the Asia Society. So it's a particularly important institution playing a role as a bright spot in what is many ways a dark story. Because it is a dark story, I want to begin with at least a little bit of levity in a couple of ways for a lunchtime talk. First of all, it's also a daunting place for me to be talking about this particular thing because I know that there are some people in the audience who I read to follow up, to keep up with what's going on in issues of censorship in Hong Kong and larger China. So I look forward to questions and comments. And also in the audience is my friend Michel Bonin, who I'm going to perhaps embarrass by beginning by reading out a wonderful letter that he wrote to the Chinese censors after a story broke over the summer that Cambridge University Press had pulled a series of articles from their website in China. It was often said that people couldn't access those articles in China. That was true. What was worse was that if you searched the journal for articles about subjects like Tiananmen or Taiwan, Tibet, or the Cultural Revolution, it made it seem that those articles did not exist. And that's a very big difference. And I think the same thing has happened from what I can tell with the issue with just announced that Springer, a very large publisher, was doing the same, which is making things disappear, and making things disappear in the sense that you aren't even aware that you're not being able to see them. And if if the government's idea in China is that this is keeping unsafe material from the hands of people who it could do harm to, sort of like pornography is kept out of the hands of children, it's not that people know that this taboo material is there and maybe they can make extra steps to try to get access to it when they're in another setting, but it just makes it disappear. So anyway, without further ado, Cambridge then reversed its decision on put the material back onto its Chinese site and actually made it free available online. I had a personal stake in this because I edit the Journal of Asian Studies, and there was also a list given to Cambridge University Press of 100 or so articles that they wanted to have disappear from our site. That never happened because they got such blowback for the China Quarterly thing. And people have sometimes said, well, it's great, Journal of Asian Studies didn't bow to censorship. Well, we really didn't want to be censored, but the China Quarterly wasn't given a choice. The decision was made, and so we were just lucky that we were going to be number 2 in doing that, and it didn't happen. Anyway, Michel wrote this letter to the addressed to the heads of the Chinese censorship organization. During the last few days, I've been reading about the fact that Cambridge University Press has accepted a request by your administration to delete from their Chinese website around 300 articles published and distributed by the China Quarterly. When I saw the Cultural Revolution and the repression of the Tiananmen democratic movement on June 4th, 1989 were particularly targeted, I naturally assumed that my article in the recent special issue of China Quarterly, dedicated to memories and legacies of the Cultural Revolution, would be among those that were banned. How disappointed I was to discover, indeed shocked, that my paper was one of 2 articles in this issue that did not make it onto the list of prohibited reading. even though the paper included an important reference to June 4th as a decisive turning point for the Chinese people. There's also a reference to Secretary General Xi Jinping as someone who has used his experience as a sent-down youth to generate political capital. Then he went on to say the censors must have been fairly lazy or overworked. How could they have missed such as this? And then said, still, I would like them to repair the mistake. Its omission from the list makes me feel embarrassed in front of my colleagues who could justly believe that I have received undeserved special treatment. They may think I engaged in some form of self-censorship when writing my paper, or they could even suspect that the favored treatment I received is the result of a special relationship I have with the Chinese authorities. These and other interpretations could cast a shadow on my academic integrity. Now, it's beautiful. What I want to say, though, is I'm doubly embarrassed because I had articles that should have been banned from both the China Quarterly issue and the Journal of Asian Studies issue, and neither of them were on the taboo list. One of them was about the 1989 protests and the massacre. It's just we didn't use the term Tiananmen in the title. We called it Acting Out Democracy, Political Theater in Modern China, and somehow it slipped right through. Fortunately, or unfortunately, if they ever go back to Cambridge University Press and ask for new things, I do have an article in the Journal of Chinese History, which Cambridge published, which I'm sure will be on the taboo list, since it's called The Red Guard Generation Revisited, a book review of some Cultural Revolution things. So, but I know that feeling, actually, of feeling that not being censored can have people ask you questions. People ask me sometimes, why do I keep being able to go get visas to go to the mainland? And I have to explain, is it that I'm pulling my punches? Is it that I'm not talking about taboo subjects? And while I'm circumspect when I'm in China, I've written about Tiananmen my entire career. But still, I kind of have this feeling like I'm not quite going to write a letter to the visa board saying, please stop me at the border to improve my integrity. But I do say that when I go to China now, I prepare for my last trip to the mainland, because you never know when you will get banned. And one thing about this is I've never before had even a second thought about coming to Hong Kong, because of course Hong Kong, you don't need a visa, everybody gets in through the border. Perhaps they would turn back somebody who was a dissident within China. They came, they've hassled Tiananmen protesters going to come, but surely somebody who looks like me wouldn't get stopped on the border. But then a British MP, of course, was stopped. And not that I'm that important, and I was almost sure I would come in, but I thought it was maybe 99.8% certain that I'd sail through the passport control. But in the past, it had been 100%. And I think any diminution of that kind of certainty really matters, as those of you living here, I think, know. All right, well, that was one effort at levity, but I have one other, and this is a joke. It's the only joke that I tell. It talks like this. It's the only joke I tell when I'm talking about human rights issues, because there really aren't many good human rights jokes that you can tell about this kind of thing. But it's a joke that I first heard in the mid-1980s in Shanghai, and I later learned that the version of the same joke was being told throughout the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and all that was changed was the nationality of one person. There's always an American in it, and then one person who's of whatever nationality the joke was being told in. So the joke that I heard in China goes like this. So a Chinese guy goes, there was this American who was here, and he was so full of himself and what made his country special that he said, as an American, I'm so free that I can go to any central square in any American city and shout out, Ronald Reagan's an idiot, and I won't get arrested. Nothing will happen to me. The Chinese person said, this is really pompous of the American because my country is equally free. I can go to any public square and shout out, Ronald Reagan's an idiot, and nothing will happen to me either. So a version of this, a kind of more sophisticated version of the same thing was developed into a theory by Nathan Sharansky, who had been a Russian dissident and now is in Israel. And then it was picked up by Condoleezza Rice, and it was an idea that there's something called a public square test that can tell you if you're living in a free society or a fear society. In a free society, you can say whatever you want in the public square. and you can criticize the leaders. In a fear society, you can't. And Condoleezza Rice said we should try to support the countries that are free societies and push back against those that are fear societies. And I've thought about this a lot because it's tempting to think that way, but it's actually much too crude a sense of analysis. I think there's a much subtler kind of spectrum going on. Because when I was in China in the mid-1980s, when people told this joke, they were aware that in certain ways they were living in a much freer society than they had been in during the late Mao years. And even if they couldn't go to the central square and shout out Deng Xiaoping is an idiot, there were some other things that made their life freer. One was that they had the choice to not go to the central square and shout out their loyalty to Chairman Mao. There was also a shift toward a time whereas if you crossed over a line, it was likely that you might be punished for what you did, but less likely that your family members or people you would happen to associate would be punished for that. There was also much more of a sense that in private, you could say things that were edgy or that would get you in trouble in public, but you could say them in private, which during the worst parts of the Cultural Revolution, you couldn't. Your fear was that somebody would overhear something you said in a private setting and you would get into trouble. So things were moving. So I think those are all kinds of things that you need to think about. So after being in China in the mid-'80s, I came back in 1988, and then I didn't come back to China until 1996. And having watched the Tiananmen protests and then the brutal massacre from afar, I was a little nervous about coming back to China for various reasons, including just feeling that I would encounter people who were now much more watchful of things they said than they had been before, because there was this chill, this period right after the massacre. But by the time I got there in 1996, it actually had loosened up in some ways at least as much as it had been in some regards in the mid-1980s. There were tight controls on certain kinds of protests, but there was a kind of freedom to have this underappreciated human right, which is the human right to bitch about small things that you dislike. You could go to the central square and say, the local leaders of the Communist Party are bastards, and nothing would happen to you at that point. In a way, as one, I mentioned that there just seemed to be a lot of things that you could get away with or that people could talk about. And a bartender made a comment to me that stuck with me when I asked him what, I won't quote any taxi drivers, but a bartender I will. He said, now the mood is "没有运动什么都可以." If it's not a movement, anything goes. Like, don't say you're going to organize to make any change, but if you're just talking about in private, saying certain kinds of things, nobody really cares. So I think there was this ability to be apolitical, which was true in the 80s and then still true in the 90s, and true on into the early 21st century. There were less calls for you to publicly express your loyalty, and that's, I think, the worst thing of a totalitarian kind of state, is that you're forced to do these kinds of things. And there were more zones of freedom, of sort of areas that people could do things. And in fact, political jokes are something that was interesting to me. When I was in China in the 1980s, it seemed that even though there was a lot of openness and questioning, that people were a little bit watchful of each other. People had to know each other before they started telling their best political jokes. To Chinese people would have a sense of, they need to have a sense of trust, because there was the memory of the time when even a joke could get you in trouble. By the late 1990s, I introduced two people on a Chinese campus, and they immediately started telling their favorite Li Peng jokes. Li Peng was seen as the most despised member. The jokes aren't good, so I'm not going to tell one. One had to do with an IQ measuring machine that thought Li Peng's head was a rock. Anyway, but I was struck by the fact that this idea of in private, being able to say really outrageous things about somebody who was one of the highest ranking political leaders, suggested we were in a very different terrain than a kind of classic totalitarian political state. So I bring all this up because the tendency was, even from the mid-1990s through close to about 2006, 2007 or so, that from year to year going to China, I would be struck by, if anything, the zones of freedom or the range of things that you could say had expanded a bit. And what we're seeing now is a period of now going on close to 10 years, when from year to year it's tighter as opposed to looser. And we're carrying over, at least some of the analysts, I think, are carrying over an old-fashioned idea, which is there are periods of tightening followed by periods of loosening, and that may have, in the long run, happen, but it used to be 1 or 2 years, and now we're talking about a long period when there hasn't been a significant period of loosening. And I promised that I would say something about the 19th Party Congress, and I think main thing I'm going to say about that, well, I'll say a couple things about that, but one of the main things is just that there was a lot of talk, again, that watch during the lead up to the 19th Party Congress, there'll be a tightening of controls over some kind of media and things, and there'll be people who are seen as dissidents or questionable will be put under extra pressures, will be told to take vacations and sent on vacations and things like that. But the presumption in some of the analysis was, and then you'll see people will let out their breath if things go smoothly, and there'll be a loosening. Now the question is, where is that loosening, or is that just an illusion that we're carrying on? Because it may just be building up to the next kind of moment that we need to be, the party says you need to be especially watchful so that things can go very well. The other thing about the 19th Party Congress that I think is telling, though it started well before, is we're moving toward a period where there is pressure, once again, I think more pressure to express loyalty as opposed to simply still being in a position where you can't go to the central square and criticize the leader. I think there's an idea that Xi Jinping's elevation in status to a more sacred figure amps up the rewards for being explicitly praiseful of him and increases the dangers of seeming disrespectful in any way. All right, so I wanted to talk about that joke. I wanted to talk about 2 metaphors and 2 novels and one general concept. The general concept is, living here, you hear a lot about, of course, one country, 2 systems. But I think it's useful to think of China, the PRC, having one country and 3 systems. When it comes to issues of control, freedom of speech, censorship, there's one set of rules that apply in Tibet and Xinjiang, a second set of rules that apply on most of the rest of the mainland, and a third set of rules that typically apply in Hong Kong. And you could talk about, well, even this can be seen with what I was just saying about a free society, a fierce society, and the places in between. In Xinjiang and Tibet, during recent years, there have been moments of forced expression of loyalty. If you wanted to stay on the right side of things, you had to engage in certain kinds of rituals showing your deference to the center, whereas in most of the mainland you could ignore those, and in Hong Kong you could go the extra step and have, during the umbrella movement, for example, images of Xi Jinping in a mocking kind of way, holding a yellow umbrella, or being portrayed in discourteous ways and things like that. So the thing to watch, I think, and you can think about this in all kinds of other ways than that particular thing. You can think about it in, I used to think of this idea of a book. So there would be, if there was a book praising the Dalai Lama, it could be sold in Hong Kong. It couldn't be sold on the mainland. But I used to feel that if by chance I brought a copy of it to a friend in the mainland, they might put it on their coffee table and not think anything of it. If a book like that were on your coffee table in Tibet, it could mean you were going to jail. So that was a difference between those 3 systems. I watch certain kinds of things, like booksellers, what can be sold and what not, what can be published in newspapers. All of these things can be things to keep track of what's going on. So one of the things that obviously in the last couple of years changed the kind of stability of these 3 systems that were clearly separate were things like the disappearance of the booksellers, if books were one of the things you were going to watch. There's still things that make Hong Kong different, a third system. I mean, I saw that today. There's all kinds of talk from afar about South China Morning Post having more and more loyalists loyal to Beijing kinds of editorials and closing off of space. And there is, of course, these things are true, but Joshua Wong's picture is in the South China Morning Post in the way that no comparable figure would be in a mainland newspaper, and Joshua Wong's out of prison by, in a way that you don't see with with people who've been imprisoned on the mainland. But I think the story of these three distinct systems, we've seen a creep into other parts of the mainland of some of the things that used to be associated with Xinjiang and Tibet. At the same time that Xinjiang and Tibet controls have been ramped up even more. But you have a sort of creep from Xinjiang and Tibet toward the mainland, and a creep of some things that used to be more associated with the mainland creeping into Hong Kong. And one of the things to watch would be, for example, the idea of penalties for not being properly respectful during the national anthem, and the talk of that there, and the talk of excising discussions of Tiananmen from school books. So watching that kind of creep and remembering that in the lead up to 1997, what some people were at least hoping would be that the creep would go in the other direction, that what you would have would be some Hong Kong norms would flow across the border into the mainland. And early in the 2000s, it seemed that that was part of the story as well, with things like this, that Nanfang Zhoumo was a publication near Hong Kong, and it seemed to be pushing the envelope a bit. It then got reined in under Xi Jinping. So the two novels that go along with these three systems are, and I won't go into details about this, but Louisa Lim has a new piece online with the Lowry Institute that talks about both of them in ways, and I've talked about them before in this nifty little book, the shortest book I've ever written and the shortest book I'll ever write, one of the Penguin specials. I have one about Orwell and Huxley. And so George Orwell, just in a nutshell, 1984 imagined an authoritarian regime that was ruled by fear, by the boot on the face over and over again. Aldous Huxley, who actually taught him at Eton, though people don't always know that, wrote a book called Brave New World, where the authoritarian leaders ruled by keeping people kind of busy and distracted and entertained and playing to their desires. And Brave New World is often seen as a critique of capitalism and materialism. Huxley wrote it in part after having gone to California and seen how people were living in San Francisco, and reading a book by Henry Ford. So he had this idea of the future being one of new scientific techniques and authoritarian figures that kept people materialistically contented in things. Orwell had seen darker kinds of things. He had Stalinist Russia, but also he had serving in a colonial police force in Burma as he had on his mind. He had an idea of a much tougher kind of rule. So a 1984 state is more like the structure in Tibet and Xinjiang of control. And Hong Kong was a place that if it was any of these, it would be like the Brave New World thing. And the idea was that people were in part kept busy and distracted. But I think what we've seen is both a mixing of these techniques in the mainland and a flow in different directions. And certainly the film 10 Years imagines a possible future of Hong Kong being more Orwellian. While at the same time, what we've seen in that sense is some of the Brave New World techniques on the mainland. And the thing that this has to do with censorship is people often think of control of belief on the mainland and control of politics is largely about what's kept out, and that's a big part of the story. And there was just a new part of that blocking part of the story that Ben Bland broke in the FT about Springer Publishing, also blocking content. But the other thing is just flooding of information that the government wants you to see. So part of the story on the mainland is the blocking of things coming in. The other is that you're continually bombarded with images that they want you to see, including both pictures of the leader, but also constant showing of films again about the battles against Japanese imperialism during other times, which is sort of a constant reminder of like, look at what the alternative is. You're living a good life now in a way that you couldn't have if there hadn't been somebody to stand up with that. So this kind of the culture of distraction and entertainment and keeping people busy and keeping them depoliticized that way is part of the story, as well as these harsher forms of control. But that also helps explain these varied things. So the two metaphors I want to bring up, and this is just throwing out a lot of things that could then all be subject for more discussion, is Louisa Lim, who I mentioned, and I 5 years ago wrote a piece where we talked about the ways in which artists and writers and ordinary people operated in what seemed to be a growing gray zone between things that were outright banned and the things that were too edgy, that would get you in trouble. There were ways that you could navigate through this kind of gray zone. I think part of the story in recent years has been on the mainland, that gray zone disappearing on the mainland, but some of the strategies that people use to navigate in this kind of in-between space being things that are becoming more important in Hong Kong. And the other metaphor, which is often used, has been used about Hong Kong in one way, and I will use it in a slightly different way, in a way that I haven't seen used, is the concept of a canary in a mine shaft. So canaries used to be lowered into mines, and if the air, if the atmosphere there was too polluted, too thin, for a human to go there, canaries had smaller lungs, so a canary would die, even if it would only be partially dangerous to a human, so you would sacrifice a canary, you would lower it down. I didn't realize until looking this up today that these were actually used in mines until 1986, when they came up with some other technique that didn't cost any life. So people have talked about Hong Kong as a canary in the mine shaft, that when it's incorporated into the People's Republic of China, we'll get a sense of what this country can allow at its most forgiving political environment by whether the canary can stay alive. And the idea was that Taiwan would look at Hong Kong and feel safe that the Hong Kong canary was still breathing fine and would be less worried about being linked in. So, but what's left out of this, and we think of this with figures disappearing into prison or disappearing into exile, but there's one other thing that can happen to a canary, and perhaps I'll end on this note, which is a canary can find it possible to keep breathing, but be unable to sing. And I think what we've seen in the mainland and watching the last few years in this tightening of controls is some of the people who were able to speak out in careful ways within the system and do so feeling that they could do this without being complete threats to their lives or their families, and were not being punished for things they said in the past, have started to go silent. And sometimes they seem to have disappeared, but sometimes they've been, like He Weifang was taken away all of his social media accounts, which was one of the ways that he was speaking out within the system, calling for different things. Hu Hua, who was was my favorite Chinese fiction writer, would occasionally write nonfiction pieces that would appear only outside of the mainland, in Hong Kong, Taiwan, or in English in the West. And these were very clever and interesting critiques of what was going on, and he was allowed to keep writing his novels into that. And those have stopped appearing in the last couple of years. And there are other figures like that in that kind of gray zone who have gone quiet. So I think we need to not just watch the dramatic moments when canaries disappear or die, but to times when they stop being able to sing. Thanks for your attention. I look forward to questions.
Thank you very much. It's great that the canary is a little yellow bird. It's consistent with, and we'll see for how long it continues to sing in Hong Kong. I was going to ask about this, but I know we have many questions. So, okay, Ben there first. Don't forget to introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, hi, it's Ben Bland, correspondent for the Financial Times and author of a recent book on Hong Kong, which is bumping up against some of these limits of censorship in Hong Kong and China, too. We've seen that, Jeff, thanks for the talk, we've seen that the Chinese Communist Party and authorities have been using a kind of typical United Front strategy in going after publishers in the West. They're picking them off one by one, bit by bit, even journal by journal. And it seems to have been very effective so far. But obviously, if you take all the world's university presses and commercial publishers together, they have a vast trove of information that China needs for its engineering, science, everything else. So what do you think publishers should do to combat this strategy from the Chinese, given that they ostensibly have a lot to offer China and they have their own power, presumably, to push back?
So that's a great question. I was very disappointed about Springer, because Springer publishes Nature, which is clearly one of the journals that the Chinese Communist Party cares about a lot. I don't think the Communist Party cares that much about what humanists and social scientists are up to. And so us getting angry doesn't mean that much, but I think Springer had leverage and potentially, and they didn't. And I think so. I think that was very unfortunate. There has been this picking off, in some senses, you could say, already in the past with universities, with university faculty individuals being, not me, but being denied visas, and the universities not pushing back as much as they could have. And now the challenge is that the moment, the balance of power is different than it was. It was a while ago that Chinese universities were much more in need of prestigious connections to highly ranked Western universities. Now it's more difficult. I mean, I think they do care about Harvard, maybe not, some others for symbolic reasons. But I think some kind of coordinated effort is needed, and that would be a lesson from the erosion of things with universities before that.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, Benjamin Haas from The Guardian. You talked a little bit about Tiananmen at the beginning, and I'm curious, in the wake of Tiananmen, Deng Xiaoping sort of famously, I mean, not explicitly, but made the deal, stay out of politics and I'll make you all rich. And I'm curious how you think that deal is going now. I mean, are sort of your average Chinese people still interested in that, and how's that sort of holding China together?
Great. Okay, now I've gotten questions from both the Bens in the audience I read to keep up on these things. So I think I would say, I would modify it slightly differently. I would say that the deal, never articulated, but the deal was twofold. It was partly, will make you richer. But the other thing was the students at Tiananmen Square wanted a variety of things. They wanted more freedom in their private life. They wanted to be able to choose what kind of music they listened to, who they dated, what kinds of jobs they went into. So I think the combined package was both this kind of material thing, leave the political change side alone, and we'll work on continuing spreading more of the material wealth, but we'll also give people more choices in the supermarket and more choices in their ways to divert themselves. Including allowing intellectuals to read more kinds of books. It was credible what kinds of things are translated into Chinese that were never translated and sold in Communist Party-run countries. You can buy Hannah Arendt's Totalitarianism in a Chinese bookstore. You can buy 1984 in a Chinese bookstore. These were things that sold in it. There were things that were banned in Communist Party parts of the world, but they're things that are consumer goods that intellectuals want. So it was giving people consumer goods and choices and more private freedoms. So the material, the economic slowdown called into question one part of that deal. Like some people thought we were supposed to be able to get rich next, but then what if the good times are over and we'll never get rich? We'll just be left behind. So that is something the Communist Party, I think, is trying to manage by starting to talk more about social welfare and at least talk more about caring for the poor and refashioning Xi Jinping's image as though he was a man of the people and somebody who cared about the poor and things like that. But at the same time, it's interesting because that other part of the deal, that sort of personal freedoms thing, is being, the screws are being tightened. There also was a degree of co-opting, bringing into the system, sort of spreading more widely some of the benefits of it among the intellectual class. So maybe that can hold off. But it is, I think, it's a risky move to be going after, to have both the material side slowing down and reining back some of the private freedoms. Although some of it's still there. I mean, you're still much more able to travel if you're doing well within China, if you're within any kind of an intellectual class or a professional class. There are all kinds of things you can do that you couldn't do a generation or more ago. So you can still think of some aspects of the Tiananmen protests getting for the next generation things that were really frustrating 20-year-olds at the time. And it'll be interesting to see what it takes to alienate that generation again, to have things that make them feel that the kind of outrage that saying this deal just isn't enough.
Next question.
Hi, I'm Daryl Smith, Hong Kong resident. Loved the analogy about the canary breathing and not being able to sing. And speaking of that, hearing that the BBC World Service is going to be stopped in Hong Kong, can you explain why that is?
So the BBC World Service, I mean, these are kind of stories where I'm glad you brought that up, because I meant to say that that's an example of, it's not exactly censorship, right? Because people can still go online and get the BBC World Service, but it's about the flooding. And it's about the strategies being used to kind of make the default mode to think in a certain way. So I was here right before the 20th anniversary of the handover, and all over there were these posters up talking about the glories of the handover and just trying to, so there's more of the kind of advertising for the Communist Party coming in that just, if you're not really paying attention, you've got to think of the people who aren't really paying attention to the news, but are just getting a sense of it becomes a sense of common sense of how you're supposed to think of those things. So I think that's a good example. I will say Hong Kong is still inspiring because there are canaries that are still singing beautifully. Denise Ho, the person I'd most like to meet in Hong Kong at some point, who is, despite being deprived of commercial sponsorships and endorsements because of her support for Umbrella Movement, has continued to be outspoken in different ways. And that is still, that's a very kind of, it's also good to prize these voices when they still can be heard.
Next question. Yes.
Can you tell...
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, sorry. Johannes Schröter, also Hong Kong resident. Can you tell how exactly it works between the censors and the university presses or Springer? What kind of inducement do the censors offer in order to comply? What kind of threats do they make in case of non-compliance? I just fail to understand why anyone is complying.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's often quite murky and it's quite separate, and it's often a kind of mix of preemptive self-censorship and actual, the implied idea is you've got a wide range of things that you want to be available in the Chinese market. Here are some things we'd rather you didn't make available here. Is it really that, isn't it worth it to do some kinds of modifications just so that we would hate anything to go wrong with this relationship kind of thing? So it's, there are, of course, there are moments that you decide sort of what's okay. I think that the issue, none of my books have been translated on the mainland. People who come up with books that are translated, and then the publisher says, well, we'd like to publish your book. Here are all kinds of readers who would have it, but we need you to cut such and such a paragraph. I've never quite gotten that deal. I have too much that would be cut, so they'd be really short books. Anyway, what I'd like to think I would do, or I think the most respectable thing, is to say, okay, we'll do that as long as it's clear that something is being cut. That's not that big a deal, actually. When you see a movie on an airplane that had a sex scene in it and the sex scene has been cut, it'll say at the beginning, this showing of the film has been modified for general audiences. So that would be something that wouldn't be, but there are some people who don't push even for that. And I think that gives the illusion that what you're getting in the Chinese edition is the same as what was in the original edition. I think that's a problem. So that's why I stressed, publishers, the way in part they do, look, if you're going to cut material that from the journals and not make it available, then that's something you have to do. It's not something we're going to help you do. And I think Cambridge University Press appropriately, after making the initial mistake, realized that and said they'd made a mistake and that they shouldn't have done that to make it any easier. Springer so far seems to be defending the choice by saying this is such a small part of a massive enterprise there.
What has happened to Cambridge after the...
So Cambridge University Press since then have been kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop. And I think if there is any pushback, it won't be so much because they reversed the censoring, but they also then made the taboo articles free, available online as a kind of extra thing of making up for their initial mistake. But this was another thing where the idea was the 19th Party Congress is coming up, this is a special moment, wait until after that, we'll see. I mean, we don't know what'll happen. At that point, these publishers, they're not just publishers of scholarly journals. They publish translations, they publish textbooks and things. But I think at a certain point you have to be willing, you have to make it clear where you're just going to walk away from a China market, no matter how lucrative it is, if there are just lines you won't cross.
So we have time for 2 more questions.
Tony Watson, the Hong Kong Society of Financial Analysts. Do you think more needs to be done to highlight the role of the Chinese Student and Scholar Association, the CSSA, on Western campuses specifically, and more broadly, other United Front organs such as the Confucius Institute throughout Western society? Thanks.
Those are really, really complicated things. I think there needs to be heightened awareness of these kinds of things. I think it's a very tricky moment in America right now because of all the strange kinds of things going on politically, and also an increasing sophistication of sometimes the use of the language of inclusion, diversity, and political correctness, and these things by organizations. I think the Confucius Institutes, they're very varied from setting to setting, and I think they're actually a smaller part of the picture than some of the bigger things. I mean, they're worth being careful about, and I think monitoring what they're doing. But I think there are other ways in which the mutual entanglement of Western universities and dependence on Chinese money, some of it is actually in much larger amounts than the Confucius Institute itself. There's a lot of really, the sort of forefront of this in different ways at the moment is Australia, where there's both been more inroads and there's been there's a lot of pushback by scholars there. So I just encourage you, if you're not already aware of them, to follow people like John Fitzgerald that are writing out of that.
So I'm delighted to give the last question to Michel Bonin, who is the writer of this very sarcastic letter we heard.
Well, okay, thank you, Jeff, for inviting me and quoting me. I like your speech. I think you have a knack to use the images to pass your message, and the Canary image is a good image. Well, I wanted to add a comment, and also I have a question. I add a comment on the question of censorship. I think that when internet arrived in China, many people thought that the censorship was finished, and they've proved that they could efficiently block many things on the internet, and one way was to outsource censorship to the companies, to the internet companies. So now, you have thousands of people employed by these companies like Tencent or other companies, internet companies in China, to censor. Mm-hmm. It's not the government, it's the companies themselves. So, but they are forced to do this, otherwise they cannot work and make money. And now what we see is this outsourcing is projected in the world, and I think that it's very dangerous for the West, and we have to say no, because otherwise we will become like inside China, and so inside China they have no way to resist, but outside China you can resist. So I think that's something that is very important to understand, that this outsourcing has no end if you accept to collaborate. Mm-hmm. Another thing is that about this idea that you have the visa, you are always afraid of the visa problem. I have the same problem. And I'm always surprised that I can go in China. And, but in fact, I think it's quite simple. They are different from the Soviets. The Chinese Communist Party, if you have no organization, if you do not take part in an organization they find hostile, then it's okay. So they make a difference, and I think they are more clever about the risks. And actually, you and me are not really risky. Okay? Now, the question is about the question of totalitarianism. Because many people think that after Mao, there is no totalitarianism in China, it's an authoritarian government. And I do not agree. I said in the 90s, I wrote an article in French saying that there are metamorphoses of totalitarianism. And there is a difference between the Chinese regime and an authoritarian because there is no civil society. Civil society is destroyed systematically. And there is no church outside of the power.
So what is the question?
So my question is that I thought it was a kind of negative totalitarianism. And now we can see something new with Xi Jinping that maybe I would call, could be called a neo-totalitarianism.
Okay.
So what do you think about that?
Okay. So
We're over time already, so
Okay.
a packed up answer, please, Jeff.
yeah, so I still hold on to the idea, like some people are now saying, like, look, it's getting so bleak that all optimism was misplaced. I don't think that way. I think there were people who were overly optimistic and had these fantasies the internet would magically change China or growing middle class would magically democratize China. I always felt very, very skeptical, but I always felt that a very kind of cautious optimism was possible, to say that you looked at little shifts, you looked at the way in which people were living slightly freer lives, the way there was a little more room. And I think if the world had gone in a different direction, it's possible that those forces, I think we should keep in mind the unpredictability of the world. There were not people all saying around in 1988, wow, in a couple of years, communist parties are going to fall here, here, and there, the Soviet Union will fall. There were, I think, possibilities, as weak and fragile and, of course, as tenuous things were. So I won't quite give up on that. And I think, yes, there's a cleverness. There's a cleverness to allow, Hong Kong to exist rather than to have done things that would be so brutal. And there's an erraticness to it, which is part of the power, the what's banned or who's banned and all that. It's partly to keep it from being very things. But I want to say just two things final, because I didn't mention the piece by Michelle that I quoted. It originally was a letter in a listserv, and I said, this is so good, it should be published. And it was published in the Los Angeles Review of Books in a China blog that's now become a China channel. And so if you are interested, check out the LARB China channel. I think it's very important to have information about China as information within China is more and more controlled, that there be a proliferation of places that are talking about China in ways that it can't be talked about within. And there are many good sites out there, and this is just one more that was added to this. And since I mentioned journalists in the audience that made me nervous to be speaking here, Ilaria Maria Sala is there, one of the people I always read for information on this, and co-wrote something with on watching what disappears in Hong Kong very carefully, and look at what appears that didn't used to appear, like those posters celebrating the anniversary, or keep an eye on how many banks start using Belt and Road ideas to try to promote themselves. We need to be watchful not just about the control and the censorship, but also the flooding and the effort to make us think as normal what is actually something with a political agenda. So thanks so much for your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And thank you for reminding the importance of the club and its mission against censorship. As a token of appreciation, here is a...
Oh, thank you very much. Yellow,